This is a very, very important conversation, so I'm hoping that more people will come into the room. We only have about 20, 30 minutes to talk about regulation and funding, and we've got some amazing people here to share their views and their insights. So I want to kick things off straight away and ask probably one of the most difficult questions, and it's about implementing effective regulation. So there's so much talk about the need for regulation to safeguard environmental assets, but we do know that the relationship between policymakers and the actual implementation of regulation is a very complicated one. So what are the challenges that are currently being faced for those who are trying to implement effective regulation at the moment?
Yeah. Well, first, hi everyone. I'm Juliana from Mindwell. And I, love the question because I believe regulations are extremely fundamental for climate change. And why? Mainly two reasons. One, it provides funding through, bills and federal grants for companies to develop new technologies that are not economically viable. And also force companies to comply and look for harmless solutions. Let me give you an example. So in the first one, we have the Inflation Act, Infrastructure Bill, that basically provides $800 billion over the next decade for companies to develop new technology. At Mindwell, we basically help companies to raise capital, and especially in the more industrial sector within climate tech, which contributes about 30% of CO2. Those industries are very capital intensive, right? Asset heavy. And for those companies, having those grants can make the difference between surviving or not. So that's one point. And then the second point in forcing companies to comply. Let me give you an example I think most of you will relate, which is waste, right? We all throw waste daily. And let's give an example of glass. So I don't know if you're familiar with recycling, but only 30% of glass is recycled in the US. 70% go to landfills. However, when you look at state level, there's a big difference between some states that have about 60% recycling rate versus other states, most states around below 30%. And the difference is basically regulation. It's a bottle bill that basically forces states to pay some money for collecting bottles. Recycling obviously is great, but when you look at recycling glass, you're basically saving about 20 to 30% CO2 versus virgin glass. There are other solutions that are even better, like one option is a very interesting company that uses post-consumer glass to produce a cement replacement and then saving 95% of CO2. That's because when you recycle glass, you melt. When you provide a cement replacement, you skip this melting process. It's more like grinding, cleaning, mainly cleaning. However, when you look at the waste management companies, most of the large waste management companies, they own landfills. So for them, it's cheap just to send their waste to landfills. And obviously, it's not economically friendly. With regulations, we can force those companies to do the right thing and send their glass, recycling back to bottle, concrete, or other alternatives. So that's why I think regulations are extremely important within climate tech.
So would you say that lobby groups are guilty of preventing or blocking very important regulation that can help protect the environment?
I also think it's a question of education.
Okay.
In this example I mentioned, I think we still have to do a lot of education to explain, there's a path for recycling, but maybe there's better alternatives which are easier to implement. And that goes through in this case, but there's many others. So I think it's education and us as consumers, requesting companies to do the right thing.
That's great. Let's talk a bit about money, because nothing happens without a bit of money. So it's not as easy as people think. You just look at a project and you throw money at it and hope that you're going to get a great return on investment. There are some challenges as well to investing in, sustainable projects. Rune, you're an investor. Can you talk us through some of those challenges?
Yeah, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
I don't know. Can everyone
on?
hear Rune?
Great.
Lady says
Oh,
no.
yes. Oh, yes.
Can everyone hear me?
Better? Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Sorry.
You can tell I grew up in a
Sorry,
big
guys.
family.
Well, listen, thanks. Let me turn this the other way around. Like, how many investors, professional investors in the audience right now? Raise a hand. Okay, a few. Good. How many are familiar with UN's principles of responsible investments? Yay. One or two? Yeah, sorry. I'll try to speak louder. So, in 2020, according to the founder of British venture capital, Sir Ronald Cohen, stated that only 1/3 of VCs and PE firms actually signed up to these principles. And I think, to me, one thing, education and communication about actually we can do more in terms of setting up these frameworks and being committed to actually invest, not only based on financial returns, but also like considerations around like social and also environmental considerations, of course. And I think one of the big questions is actually like, if you look at the majority of VCs, especially the space that I'm in, right, like we don't really have a way to, or we think we don't have a way to measure impact or impact investments, right? But there's actually out there, right? I mean, HSBC, as an example, created impact-weighted accounts some years ago, right? And there are other examples as well where you actually can, put a financial term against the impact investments that you do, right? And measure that. And I think like the whole point is you got to put impact first, and the more impact you do and you measure that, the more profit you make, right? And I think these tools are already there, but very few people actually know, right? And I think that's the ongoing continuous education and communications towards VCs and everybody is critical to me.
Now, the education, I think, is very important, and we're fighting a very negative narrative in the press about crypto and blockchain, and I mean, people can't seem to wrap their head around the potential, the good things about blockchain and how it can change the world for the better. So definitely, we've got the media against us as well, and investors need to be convinced of the great opportunities in environmental investing. The question I have as well, for those that are willing to take the risk, where do you see the greatest opportunities for investors right now that are keen to put their money in sustainable projects?
That's a good question. Obviously, I believe in transparency and the technology that we probably, most of us here, like live in and breathe, gives that. It also gives privacy, but that's another consideration. But I do think that transparency gives us the ability to provide data and make people more informed. So I think in general, the space that we're operating in is extremely exciting and important, but like it cannot live in isolation, right? We also have AI. We have I'm not talking about necessarily about generative AI, but talking about AI and machine learning models that help us reduce energy consumptions and so forth, right? That's just going to continue to be critically important. And I think there's obviously a lot of focus on carbon credits as one example. I think that's a hugely interesting area. We talk about regulations here as well. Some will speak more about that in a minute, but like there are like a lot of questions around that still. But I certainly think that there is that. We actually see a lot of founders come to us and say like, we want to do this or we want to do that. I want to buy a piece of land and then I want to put blockchain on it. And then I'm like, okay, that's cool, but and so the people are there, the entrepreneurs and the problem solvers are there. But I don't think like we've seen like at scale, what can be done, right? But clearly, there are things to be done, and also in some of the other VCs that I work with, and even our LPs, like we discussed this, how can we marry climate impact investments with blockchain, right? But it's hard, right? So I think like we're still searching for that, right?
Definitely. Dana, I want to turn the conversation now to blockchain. So you've proven with Flowcarbon the potential of blockchain to help prevent further damage to the environment and, safeguard environmental assets and using it as a force for good. How can we convince other businesses to adopt blockchain for sustainable projects and, encourage more investors to back sustainable blockchain projects as well.
Let's see if this works. Can anyone hear me? Yeah? Totally? Yeah, you're in the front. Can anyone in the back hear me? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to literally scream. Okay. So, great question. To repeat it, the question was, how can we marry sustainability and blockchain in a way that's viable? How can we get investors interested in this overlap and this intersection? How can we leverage blockchain technology to support more sustainable businesses? Big question, lots of potential answers. I'll say two things. Because the word regulation is in the title of this panel, I'll say something about the sort of broader regulatory legislative landscape, which is very simple. This community, the ReFi community, and the intersection of climate and Web3 is actually a really, really helpful use case that is friendly to those who are looking at blockchain on the Hill in DC, at various agencies, and even internationally. How do I know this? Well, I know this in a lot of ways, and I think Jonathan's going to talk about some of this also. But we at Flowcarbon, we're heavily engaged in policy, which means we engage in Washington, D.C. a lot. Do I need to be holding this like this? Yeah. And presenting lawmakers who are thinking about crypto legislation and regulation, the regulators and the legislators, with this example where you take an environmental commodity or asset that's called a carbon credit, you move it on chain, you thus facilitate more liquidity, more transparency, in immutable connection to the data that underpins the carbon credit. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, we can get into that. Explaining that to lawmakers puts a very friendly, helpful, productive face on Web3. And so I think the more use cases that we can present to those that are thinking about how to regulate and legislate in blockchain, the more helpful it is. And the fact that much of the projects that we do as a ReFi community stem from impact and climate is even better, right? Because there's a very positive real-world outcome that everybody kind of gets behind. So, from a sort of like messaging or positioning standpoint, it is helpful to have real use cases to present to those that are not just, cryptocurrencies to present. So that's one. The other thing I'll say is blockchain itself as a technology can facilitate investment into projects. That is exactly what moving some of these markets on-chain is intended to do. And so to explain that, I'll take a minute to go through Carbon Markets 101. How many of the people that are in this room are familiar with the voluntary carbon market and how it works? Oh, great. But it's not everyone. So we're going to go into it like really quickly, kindergarten version. So on the supply side of the market, you have projects that are intended to reduce or remove carbon from the atmosphere. They could be nature-based, conservation, tree planting, restoring mangrove ecosystems, which is a phenomenal project type, or it could be other stuff. It could be distributing clean cooking mechanisms to those in the developing world that are currently chopping down trees and then burning them in their dwellings, which is akin to smoking 20 packs of cigarettes a day for women and girls largely. It's crazy. So that's a project type. There's biochar production, which is turning waste wood into this, you run it through a machine, you turn it into this other thing called biochar, which is a net carbon sink. Waste wood, emitting carbon, run it through a machine. But these projects are not economically viable, right? You make a lot of money by not doing these projects. You make a lot of money by clear-cutting forests. You make a lot of money by conducting agriculture in a non-sustainable way, in the way that it's been done for decades, if not centuries. You make a lot of money by destroying ecosystems. To just step in and say, oh, I'm going to put a fence around 100 million hectares of the Amazonian rainforest. What's the revenue model there? Why would you do that? The answer is carbon credits. It was a unit, or was an asset that was invented as basically an artificial revenue stream to these projects. So if you do the project and you can prove to the carbon credit issuers that you're doing this project in the right way, then they will issue you carbon credits in the exact amount of the carbon that you're removing or reducing from the atmosphere. So that's the supply side of the market. It's projects all over the world doing awesome things, getting those project certified, getting carbon credits issued to them, and then they have to sell it into the demand side of the market. Who buys these things? Corporations, as part of their overall decarbonization strategies. Now, 5 years ago, that was a pretty small demand side segment. This was a $500 million market in 2020. Growing rapidly, so 4x growth since then. In 2022, it was a $2 billion market, and there's all kinds of projections for what the market growth trajectory looks like, but it's somewhere between $50 to $180 billion by 2030, depending on whose projections you like. I like the $180 billion projection, personally. That's right. And so the demand side is growing. You now have between 4,000 and 5,000 corporations that have committed officially to what's called a net zero. They made a net zero commitment. And as part of this, it's overall decarbonizing. And as part of that, you offset some of the emissions that you have, the residual emissions that you can't stop doing, basically. So you have a really, really robust setup for a market that can scale rapidly, because the demand side is growing rapidly. On the project side, there's limitless projects we can do. All you need is the ability for the money to flow from the demand side to the supply side in an efficient, transparent, liquid manner. And it's not happening off-chain at all. This is an 80% over-the-counter market. Through brokers and traders and other intermediaries, there is something like a 30% average value extraction per transaction. There's non-standardized contracts, like everybody's pulling out their own paper. We know this, we're very active in the market generally, in all ways, including this. And so, creating a token that is simply backed by these carbon credits, right? Every carbon credit that's issued on the demand side, you could make a token that is public, that is on blockchain, that represents these carbon credits, and then all of a sudden you have the makings of a liquid, transparent, 24/7, 365 market. You can start pooling these credits together for a more liquid trading environment, and you can have access for anybody on the demand side, right? It's obviously very expensive to navigate this OTC market, which is why only big corporations are doing it and spending a lot of money to not get it wrong. All of a sudden, you have access. Anybody in this room can buy carbon credits and thus support these projects. Businesses of any size can buy carbon credits. So it's you can take these composable carbon credits and plug them into protocols for automatic offsetting. So that's a big expansion on the demand side. So you have the ability to create a liquid, accessible market, which inherently supports all kinds of businesses. On the supply side, pipes, the whole ReFi ecosystem that would be built on top of this. So simply by letting this happen and by building the infrastructure to facilitate it, you're funding a lot of businesses. Sorry, that was a very long answer. I'm going to let you speak for a half hour now.
It was a great answer. Great answer. Yeah.
I think Dana should run for U.S. presidency.
God, no.
We need the
Thank you.
We need the passion there.
I'm loud.
You raised a really good point about, real use case studies, and I think that would help a lot in shaping the narrative. I keep talking about the media because I was a journalist for many years, and now I'm working in public relations, but that is for us the biggest challenge. How do we convince journalists to write positively about our cause? Because the more they write positively about it, the more investors and population at large will back what we're trying to achieve here. So Jonathan, you come from the world of investment, grant making. Can you give us some examples of real world case studies where you've seen amazing companies leveraging the power of blockchain to help safeguard the environment?
Sure. So I'm going to have to try to project the way Dana does, and that will not be, I'm doomed to fail. But yes, so coming from the perspective of the A Square Foundation, we're a grant-making organization, so we're not taking stakes the way a VC would, but rather attempting to accelerate the Hedera ecosystem, our native blockchain, but with a particular goal. I'm head of policy with the Sustainable Impact Fund, and we're focused on, just as Dana said, accelerating the supply side, and so there are lots of different sort of project level carbon removal projects all around the world where folks are trying to create environmental benefits and get them certified by the handful of agencies around the NGOs in the world. There are two primary gold standard in ETHDenver that run I think it's like over 80% of all of the credit issuance, carbon credit issuance. But the challenge is that those projects are difficult to fund, right? They require big capital upfront investments, and as I think Dana said in an earlier panel, this market has failed to scale for a long time because on the demand side, the assets that are generated from these projects, have a reputation problem, right? There are concerns that this has all existed in, for the most part, in paper form, right? So you have a certificate, somebody signs it, suggests that there's a project in Africa where trees have been planted, and that's all the information that you have. So what our focus at the HBAR Sustainable Impact Fund has been upfront to provide the infrastructure technology to improve the quality of those assets when you digitize them. And so as one example, we have funded a company called Envision Blockchain, and they have worked to create an application on Hedera that we've called the Guardian, which essentially involves tokenization of these natural capital assets in a way that will embed all of the metadata. So you have all the roles and actors associated with the underlying projects, and the resulting tokens, the digital representation of the carbon credit will then be sort of transparent to the world. You know precisely what the project involved. You know who the verification and validation bodies were and the individuals involved that worked on that project. That kind of the building of this tool, the ability to mint these tokens, in our case on Hedera, but you can have this technology in other chains. The advantage of this is that we will improve the reputation of these credits over time, increase demand. The major corporates who have made these net zero commitments will be more willing to invest more dollars in the purchase of these credits, and you'll get scaling of this market. But as many have said, the title of this panel is regs, and it's important to recognize this all exists in the context of a regulatory vacuum.
Yeah.
Certainly in the United States, but around the world, these assets are generally traded only in the voluntary markets. There are mandatory compliance markets where emissions are traded, but principally all the action is in the voluntary carbon markets. And so one question is whether there's these independent groups, Vera, Gold Standard, are they as much as we need to stimulate additional investment? And so maybe you want to talk about that.
So, some of the most interesting projects out there seem to court a lot of controversy in the press, and the governments don't like it. So I'll give an example of making sunsets. Has anyone ever heard of making sunsets? So, they're a geoengineering company. They claim to be a force for good, trying to mitigate climate change by manipulating, essentially, weather. They were recently banned in Mexico, I think, and other countries are going to follow suit. So the government doesn't want them to operate in their countries. Regulators don't want to even touch them. They're blocking their development. And I guess the question I have, maybe you can answer this, Jonathan, because obviously you talked about a regulatory vacuum. But when you have companies like this, is it ever justifiable to have regulators and governments blocking such important projects?
Sure. So I think one of the challenges, and Julianne referred to this, in the government regulatory space, you regulate in the United States, for example, using a notice and comment process where you get the public to participate, right? And the advantage of that is that you get a deliberative process that incorporates the views and interests of a wide proportion of the regulated community and all other interested parties. And what that does is it can facilitate the identification of potential unforeseen consequences, right? And so in the atmospheric geoengineering space, I think the general thought is these technologies could be very promising, but one group that engages in them will be engaging in them for us all, right? So if you are emitting reflective particles into the atmosphere in the hopes of increasing the albedo of the planet, reducing temperatures, well, that's not a choice that we're all making together. That's a choice being made by individuals, companies. We're not doing it in a sort of public and a sort of community-mediated way. And so, government regulatory processes do that, but they do it at the price of being slow, right? And so, from the perspective of, so your question could go to two things. It could go to whether organizations like mine are comfortable investing in projects like that, right? And it could go to the question of whether or not the environmental regulators around the world should prohibit those projects for fear of the negative, unforeseen environmental consequences, the externalities that could result. And so, from a government perspective, I think the goal would be to engage in that notice and comment rulemaking process in a way that incorporates large groups of people to do the cost-benefit analysis, but to not to approach it with an innovation policy that isn't overly prohibitive. But from an investor perspective, I think and the other investors in this room can speak to this too. The question is, what due diligence do we perform, right? It is, I think, incumbent upon everyone in the climate space to recognize the tension between the speed that we need to employ to get these projects off the ground and the danger that, in the case of geoengineering, atmospheric engineering, if even small mishaps can affect the reputation, the optics concerns could result in over-regulatory responses that could inhibit innovation. It could reduce demand because suddenly the reputation associated with the resulting assets plummets. And so I think there's no easy answer, but there is a tension that we have to be attentive to, both on the investor and the regulatory side.
Due diligence on the blockchain as well. Record everything on a visible ledger. We, I think, have time for just one more question, and I think this ties in really well, and it's about ethics. How do you measure the ethical footprint of an investment?
Yeah, great. There's several disclosure guidance, TCFD, SASB, GRI. Those are guidance for companies on how to report. And it's not only environmental, but governments, right, the whole ESG. In the end of the day, those guidance are great to provide guidance, but I think companies still have flexibility to report according to what they want to show, and something we're missing is more benchmarks. If you look at very heavy industries that are key for climate change, for example, mining, we need minerals, right? We need to increase supply of key minerals by 500%, 800%. But we know it's a very intensive industry, and I have looked through reporting of several mining companies. It's impressive how hard it is to compare. So I think we cannot leave for companies to do it. I think it's great to have those guidance, and there's a lot of companies working on reporting, supporting corporations on how to report. And then as I step back is how they get the data, right? And there's a lot of double counting, and transparency, in my opinion, is the most important thing in climate tech, because without transparency, we can get funding, right? So I think that's when blockchain could play an important role, helping to track in the supply chain, avoiding double counting. I think still a long way to go, but I think it's exciting to see all the technologies we have there to help, measure, disclosure, and optimize, because in the end, that's what we're looking for, optimizing, reducing emissions.
If we have all those things in place, regulators are probably more inclined to introduce and enforce policies to help us safeguard the environment and do all the good work we want to do. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. This is a difficult slot because I know everyone's very hungry. But if you have any questions, please come and see us afterwards. And thank you very much for your interest and joining us on this conversation.